We tend to think of family as, this totally unbreakable bond.
Hmm.
But what happens when that bond really frays, maybe even breaks completely?
Yeah.
Today, we're diving deep into something pretty complex.
Mm.
Parental estrangement,
It's a tough one. We've looked at quite a bit surveys, expert views from psychology.
right? Trying to get a handle on why some adults choose to cut ties with their parents and maybe what that means more broadly.
Exactly. And our goal really is just to pull out the key insights for you, try to offer some clarity without, drowning you in data.
Let's get into it. How common is this actually?
Well, it's pretty striking when you look at the numbers.
Hmm.
There was this big German study, followed over 10,000 people for 13 years.
Okay.
Get this? 9% had been estranged from their mothers at some point, and 20% from their fathers.
20% from fathers. Wow, that's a lot higher.
It is. And then in the U.S., sociologist Carl Pillemer, his survey found 10% were currently estranged from a parent or child.
10% currently. So these aren't tiny numbers we're talking about.
Not at all. It really makes you wonder what's driving it.
Absolutely. That 20% figure for fathers. Any initial thoughts on why it might be so much higher than for mothers?
That's a really interesting question. The studies don't spell it out directly, but, well, you could speculate, couldn't you?
Mhm.
Maybe something to do with traditional family roles. Perhaps fathers, historically, sometimes seen as more distant, maybe more authoritarian in certain family setups.
That could lead to different kinds of conflict over time, maybe.
Possibly. It's definitely something that needs more research, to really unpack that difference.
For sure. And Pillemer, he also brings up this idea about shifting views, right? How we see family itself might be changing.
Yeah, exactly. He suggests that something may be considered, well, unthinkable years ago, an adult child just having zero contact with parents. It's becoming more common now.
And maybe less stigmatized.
Potentially. You think about how families look different now, more kinds of partnerships, people choosing not to have kids.
Right.
Maybe that old pressure to keep all family ties, no matter how healthy they are, maybe that's weakening a bit.
Like a growing sense that sometimes your own well-being might mean needing some distance.
Precisely. It's not just about obligation anymore, perhaps.
Which sort of leads into another idea, this concept of rising individualism that clinical psychologist Joshua Coleman talks about. How does that fit in?
Well, think about it like this. Maybe older generations really prioritized, family duty, keeping up appearances above almost everything else.
Okay.
But a culture of individualism tends to put more weight on your personal well-being, your identity, your self-discovery.
So if that relationship with a parent is consistently negative or feels damaging to your sense of self?
Then yeah, from the individualistic standpoint, the choice to step back might feel more justified, maybe even necessary for your own health.
That makes sense.
And there's actually a study suggesting this older parents in countries seen as more individualistic, like the US, Israel, Germany, the UK, they were more likely to report having difficult relationships with their adult kids.
Interesting. So it's less family first, no matter the cost,
Right.
and more about, are these relationships actually good for me as an individual?
Something like that, yeah. A more nuanced calculation, perhaps.
Okay, so given this backdrop, what are the actual reasons people make this incredibly difficult decision?
Well, one thing that's changing is how therapists view it.
Mhm.
There's more understanding now that estrangement isn't automatically a negative reflection on the adult child.
It's not seen as just giving up necessarily.
Right. Often, these adults have faced really significant challenges within the family. Sometimes it's what you might call ethical failures, things like abuse, sadly.
Different forms of abuse.
Yes. Or maybe dealing with a parent who's struggling with addiction or has traits we'd call narcissistic, that lack of empathy, grandiosity.
Or borderline personality disorder, which can make relationships really unstable.
Exactly. Those are very challenging dynamics to navigate long term.
Those are definitely serious, major issues. But Carl Pilmer's research, it suggests it's not always about those really big, overt problems, does it?
That's a really important point. It highlights how things can build up over time.
Like a cumulative effect.
Precisely. Pillemer found many estranged adults talked about a buildup of minor negative interactions, just constant friction, ongoing tensions.
Even disagreements about things like social issues, politics.
Yeah, sometimes those fundamental value clashes can contribute to the breakdown. It's often this slow burn of smaller hurts and unresolved stuff.
And there was research in the UK, too, by Becca Blake. What did that find?
Blake looked at about 800 people estranged from family. Key themes that came up were emotional abuse, Really problematic parenting styles, things described as harsh, controlling, authoritarian, and significant neglect was another big one.
And Blake made a point about emotional abuse specifically, right?
Yes, and it's crucial. She emphasized that just because there wasn't physical or sexual abuse, it doesn't mean emotional abuse isn't incredibly damaging. It absolutely can be, and it profoundly impacts relationships.
It really paints a picture where distance isn't impulsive, but more like a response to ongoing harm or negativity.
Often, yes.
Yet, there's still this societal pressure sometimes, isn't there? This idea that you should always try to reconcile with family. How do experts view that?
Well, Nancy Molitor, a clinical social worker, argues that, yeah, that pressure exists, but sometimes cutting ties is actually the healthier, more self-protective choice.
To reduce the ongoing psychological toll.
Exactly. Getting out of that harmful dynamic, especially if you've tried again and again to make it work and it just doesn't. Creating distance can relieve that pressure of trying to fix something that feels unfixable.
Okay, so even if full reconciliation isn't on the table, is there value in just trying to understand why a parent acted the way they did?
Molitor suggests yes. Gaining insight into a parent's behavior, maybe their own history, their limitations, even if you don't forgive or reconcile, it can bring a kind of peace or closure.
Understanding without necessarily excusing or condoning.
Right. It's more about understanding the dynamics, maybe breaking free from cycles of blame, and just moving forward with a clearer head about the past.
That makes a lot of sense. Understanding can be powerful. What about the adult children themselves? How does making this choice actually impact them emotionally?
It's complex. Research like Joshua Coleman's often shows that adult children report feeling, well, happier actually, less stressed after estrangement.
Especially if the relationship was really unhappy or unsupportive.
Exactly. And this is the paradox that relief often comes mixed with sadness. Sadness for what was lost, what could have been.
And guilt, maybe?
Definitely. Guilt about breaking those societal expectations or hurting the parent, even if the decision felt necessary for their own well-being.
It's like feeling better, but also carrying this weight of loss and maybe societal judgment. Pelmer's research also touched on practical stuff too, didn't it?
It did. While people often felt happier, some also felt like they had less support. If they needed help down the line, that feeling of a missing safety net.
Right. And that feeling happier can, as you said, sometimes feel almost selfish because of those ingrained family values.
Yeah, it's a tricky emotional space to navigate.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, we need to also look at the parent side. How does estrangement typically impact the parents who are cut off?
Joshua Coleman observes that parents often feel completely bewildered, rejected, deeply hurt.
Even if they genuinely believe they were good parents.
Yes. Often, they struggle to understand why this happened, and there's a tendency sometimes to blame external factors.
Like what?
Maybe the adult child's partner, or suggesting the child has mental health issues, rather than looking inward at their own behavior or their role in the relationship's history.
So it can be really difficult for some parents to accept responsibility for long-running problems.
Very difficult. Acknowledging their part in the dynamic, or even just validating the adult child's experience, can be a huge stumbling block. And that, of course, makes reconciliation much harder.
Which brings us to memory. Carl Pilmer talks about how our memories of the past play a role here.
Yeah, his point is interesting. He suggests that even if you don't end up reconciling, having one last attempt at an open conversation about the past can be valuable.
What was that?
It's a chance for both sides to share their perspective, their memories. Even if they don't agree on the history, just hearing each other might lead to a clearer, if still painful, understanding of why things broke down.
Because unresolved stuff just festers, doesn't it?
Exactly. It leaves this legacy of hurt, sadness, confusion for everyone involved.
And Coleman's work backs this up, the idea of addressing the past.
Yes. His surveys show adult children often feel better, less stressed, a sense of relief after they've had those difficult conversations, even if the relationship doesn't get repaired.
Just the act of speaking their piece, maybe feeling heard.
It seems so. The act of addressing it can be therapeutic in itself. And Pellimer found, interestingly, only about a quarter of the people he interviewed weren't bothered by questions about their parents.
Wow.
It just shows how emotionally charged these relationships remain, even with distance.
So there's this deep need for understanding, maybe resolution, even if not reconciliation. But what about reconciliation? Does it ever happen?
It does. Actually, quite often, it seems. There was a 2022 U.S. study over 8,500 people.
Okay.
It found that over 10 years, 62% of those estranged from their mothers and 44% from their fathers did reconcile, at least for some time.
62% with mothers, 44% with fathers. So it's definitely possible.
Absolutely. And a key factor often seems to be whether the parent can acknowledge their part in the problems and show some real change.
Nancy Molitor mentioned something about that too, right? About parents showing self-reflection.
Yes, she observed that when adult children do reconnect after time apart, it's often because the parent has shown some willingness to look at themselves, to try and understand the child's perspective. That seems critical.
Okay, so let's try and pull this all together. What this deep dive really shows is that parental estrangement, it's complex, it's becoming more common.
And it seems driven by a whole mix of things, changing societal values like individualism, these buildups of negative patterns in relationships.
And often really different views or memories of the past between parents and children.
And it's so important to remember this decision to cut ties. It's almost never easy or taken lightly.
Right, it often comes from a history of feeling hurt or neglected or sometimes abused.
And while it can genuinely lead to feeling better, feeling less stressed for the adult child.